Picture this. A single drop of water falls as rain in the Ethiopian highlands. It joins a stream, tumbles down ancient volcanic rocks, merges with countless other drops, and begins a journey through 11 countries, across 6,650 kilometers, through deserts and deltas, sustaining over 400 million lives before finally emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. That drop connects nations, it powers economies, and increasingly, it sparks conflicts that could reshape the future of an entire continent. One river, 11 countries, 5,000 years of civilization, and a crisis that's been building for over a century. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I want to start by thanking all of you who support this work through Patreon and memberships. You make these deep dives possible. Before we get into this, I need to acknowledge something. This isn't ancient history, it's unfolding right now, affecting real people, real nations, real futures. I'm approaching it from a historical perspective to understand how we got here. But different perspectives exist on all sides. My goal is to trace the threads that created today's tensions. So let's begin. Today we're exploring how the Nile River became a source of conflict in the modern era. This is a story about water and power, about colonial legacies and contemporary struggles, about ancient wisdom and modern failures. And it starts 5,000 years ago. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine ancient Egypt, not the Egypt of museums and textbooks, but the living, breathing civilization. Farmers wake before dawn, planting wheat in fields that were underwater just weeks ago. Priests stand at nilometers, carved stone columns marked with measurements, watching the water level rise during flood season, calculating whether this year will bring abundance or famine. In the distance, massive stones are being transported on wooden boats along the river toward construction sites where pyramids are slowly taking shape. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he understood something profound. Without this river, none of this exists. No pyramids, no hieroglyphs, no pharaohs. The civilization that would influence human culture for millennia simply wouldn't have been possible. But here's what makes the Nile so fascinating and so contentious today. At roughly 6,650 kilometers long, it's among the world's longest rivers, yet carries surprisingly little water. Only about 5% of what the Congo River moves. The Nile has two main tributaries meeting at Khartoum in Sudan. The White Nile begins at Lake Victoria, flowing north through Uganda and South Sudan. The Blue Nile begins high in the Ethiopian highlands at Lake Tana, where those raindrops we imagined fall during the monsoon season. And here's the critical fact that echoes through every modern dispute. The Blue Nile and a third tributary called the Atbara, both flowing from Ethiopia, contribute 80 to 86% of the Nile's total water. Almost all of the nutrient-rich sediment that made Egyptian civilization possible came from Ethiopia. Remember that, because it becomes crucial when we talk about today's conflicts. The ancient Egyptians understood their river intimately, almost spiritually. They divided their entire year around the Nile's cycle. From June to September was Akhet, the inundation when the river flooded. From October to February was Pere, the growing season, when farmers planted in soil enriched by Ethiopian silk. From February to May came Shemu, the harvest. Their entire civilization synchronized to a rhythm created by monsoon rains falling 1,000 kilometers away in mountains they'd never seen. Imagine standing on the banks during Akhet, The river has been rising for weeks. Waters spread across the floodplain, covering everything up to 1.5 meters deep. Fields disappear under muddy brown water, and everyone watches, waiting to see if the flood reaches the optimal level marked on nilometers throughout the kingdom. Too little water, and 1/3 of the farmland stays dry, meaning famine and potential social collapse. Too much water destroys infrastructure, drowns livestock, spreads disease. The difference between prosperity and disaster could be measured in just 2 meters of water height. But the ancient Egyptians didn't accept this passively. Around 3200 BCE, they began one of history's most successful experiments in water management, constructing networks of earthen banks, creating basins of various sizes. These basins had sluices that could be opened and closed to direct water where needed most. Picture the scene. The flood is coming, waters rising daily. When the water reaches optimal height, engineers open gates in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Water rushes into basins, fills them, saturates the soil. After a month, they drain remaining water to the next basin. Then farmers plant crops in soil so rich it feels alive under their feet. This system, basin irrigation, worked with nature rather than against it. It sustained continuous agriculture for thousands of years, longer than any other irrigation system in human history. The Egyptians also built nilometers throughout their kingdom. These weren't just measuring devices. They were sacred spaces where the practical and spiritual merged. Priests would descend stone staircases into chambers where the Nile's water flowed through channels, checking markings daily, comparing today's level with records from previous years. When nilometers showed water approaching that perfect level, celebrations erupted. Floodgates were opened with ceremony and prayer. The Egyptians venerated Hapi, a deity of flooding and fertility. They associated Osiris, god of rebirth, with the Nile's black soil. Religion, agriculture, survival, all bound together by one river. This relationship between civilization and river created something unprecedented. Egypt unified earlier than most civilizations precisely because managing the Nile required coordination across vast distances. The pharaoh legitimized his power partly as the intermediary between gods and people, the one who could ensure the Nile's bounty. The river didn't just feed Egypt, it structured Egyptian society, shaped Egyptian cosmology, defined what it meant to be Egyptian. For 5,000 years, this system worked. Then came colonialism, and everything changed. Let's jump forward to the early 20th century. The scene shifts from ancient Egypt to the halls of colonial power. British officials in London, Cairo, and Nairobi are drawing up agreements that will control the Nile for the next 100 years. But there's something crucial missing: the voices of most people who actually live along the river. The year is 1902. Britain controls Sudan and much of East Africa. They're negotiating with Ethiopia, one of the few African territories that successfully resisted colonization. The resulting Anglo-Ethiopian Treaty is ostensibly about borders, but buried in Article 3 is language that will haunt Ethiopian development for over a century. Ethiopia agrees not to construct or allow to be constructed any work across the Blue Nile, Lake Tana, or the Sobat, which would arrest the flow of their waters into the Nile, except in agreement with His Britannic Majesty's government. Read that again. Ethiopia, the source of 86% of the Nile's water, is being told it needs British permission to build anything on its own rivers. Ethiopia disputes this, but lacks the military power to resist. The treaty stands. Now jump to 1929. Cairo. A British High Commissioner and an Egyptian official are exchanging notes that will become the foundation of Egypt's water claims for the next century. Britain is supposedly representing Sudan and its East African colonies, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika. But here's the thing, none of those territories are actually in the room. They're colonies. They have no voice. The 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty does something breathtaking in its audacity. It allocates 48 billion cubic meters of Nile water annually to Egypt and only 4 billion to Sudan. That's 92% going to Egypt, a country at the end of the river that contributes essentially nothing to its flow. It reserves the entire Nile for Egyptian use during the dry season, January to July, when water is most critical. And most controversially, it gives Egypt veto power over any upstream construction project that might affect water reaching Egypt. Imagine being Kenyan, Ugandan, Tanzanian in the decades after independence. You're told that agreements negotiated by your former colonizers, agreements you never signed, now prevent you from building dams or irrigation systems on rivers flowing through your own territory. You're told this benefits Egypt because of historical rights established during the colonial era. You're expected to accept this indefinitely. In 1959, a newly independent Sudan renegotiates with Egypt. The new agreement increases allocations, 55.5 billion cubic meters for Egypt, 18.5 billion for Sudan. But the fundamental injustice remains. The other 9 countries contributing the water, still completely excluded, still prohibited from major development. This is where the story gets interesting, because those countries start saying no. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda gain independence in the early 1960s and immediately notify the United Nations, Britain, and Egypt that they don't recognize these treaties. Ethiopia is even more emphatic. We never signed your agreements. We're not bound by them, and we'll develop our own water resources as we see fit. Picture the meetings in Cairo when these notifications arrive. Egyptian officials who've spent their careers assuming Egypt's control of the Nile is permanent suddenly face a reality where upstream countries are rejecting that entire framework. The legal basis for Egypt's water security suddenly contested. The geopolitical order established during colonialism suddenly unstable. And that brings us to 2010, and a dam that changes everything. The date is April 2nd, 2011. Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi visits a remote area in western Ethiopia, near the border with Sudan. He's there for a ceremony, the laying of the cornerstone for what will become Africa's largest hydroelectric dam. The event is carefully choreographed, designed to signal Ethiopia's arrival as a regional power. But in Cairo, when news reaches Egyptian officials, there's something close to panic. Because this isn't just any dam. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, represents everything Egypt has spent a century trying to prevent. A massive upstream project that gives another country control over the Blue Nile, the tributary that provides most of Egypt's water. Let me paint the picture of this dam's scale. The reservoir, when full, holds over 70 billion cubic meters of water. That's roughly equivalent to one entire year's flow of the Nile. The dam itself generates 6,000 megawatts of electricity when fully operational, enough to transform Ethiopia's economy and provide power to the 80% of Ethiopians who currently lack reliable electricity. But, from an Egyptian perspective, imagine this nightmare scenario. You're a country where 95% of the population lives within a few miles of the Nile because everywhere else is desert. The river provides 90% of your fresh water. Your entire civilization depends on predictable water flow. And now, another country is building a dam that can hold an entire year's worth of water, with the ability to regulate when and how much flows downstream to you. Egyptian leaders from across the political spectrum responded with threats barely disguised as diplomacy. The Nile is a matter of life and death for Egypt, they said. All options remain on the table, they warned. And everyone understood that all options included military action. In 2021, Egypt and Sudan held joint military exercises that looked a lot like preparations for something more than exercises. Ethiopia's position was equally firm. We have every right to develop our own natural resources, Ethiopian officials stated. The colonial treaties that give Egypt veto power have no legitimacy. We will proceed with the dam, and we will fill the reservoir according to our own schedule. And here's where the practical disputes got fierce. Ethiopia proposed filling the reservoir in 5 to 7 years. Egypt demanded 12 to 21 years to minimize downstream impacts. Every year of faster filling potentially means less water reaching Egypt during that period. Egyptian officials calculated that the faster filling could nearly double Egypt's water deficit, threatening agriculture that feeds over 100 million people. Multiple rounds of negotiations produced nothing but frustration. The United States tried mediating in 2019 and 2020. The talks collapsed when Ethiopia walked out, refusing to sign what it viewed as an agreement biased toward Egypt. The African Union took over mediation efforts, but found the positions impossible to reconcile. So Ethiopia made a decision. In July 2020, during the rainy season when water levels were high, they began filling the reservoir. No final agreement in place. No binding commitments about downstream flow. Just a unilateral decision that the dam was ready. The reservoir would fill, and other countries would have to adapt. Imagine being Egyptian and watching this unfold. For over a century, your country has relied on treaties, diplomatic pressure, and the implicit threat of military intervention to control the Nile. And now Ethiopia is simply proceeding, regardless of your objections, regardless of your threats. The regional order you took for granted is dissolving, and there's very little you can do about it. By 2022, the GERD began generating electricity. Ethiopia celebrated. Egypt continued objecting. And the river kept flowing, but now under new rules that nobody fully agreed to. But wait, because this story gets even more complicated when you add another layer of crisis. Picture Egypt in 1800. Population: approximately 3 million people. Now picture Egypt today. Over 105 million people. That's a 35-fold increase. Ethiopia has grown to 120 million. Sudan to 45 million. Across the entire Nile basin, we're talking about 400 million people today compared to maybe 30 million in 1900. Every one of those people needs water. For drinking, for agriculture, for survival. And the Nile's flow hasn't increased. If anything, it's becoming less reliable. Here's a number that should terrify anyone following this issue. Egypt's per capita water availability has dropped from around 1,000 cubic meters per person yearly in the 1990s to well below that today. The UN definition of absolute water scarcity is 500 cubic meters per person per year. Egypt is approaching that threshold, possibly hitting it by 2025. Some estimates suggest Egypt already faces an annual water deficit of 7 billion cubic meters. Now add climate change. The Ethiopian highlands are experiencing increasingly erratic precipitation. Some years see more rain, some years less, but the predictability that allowed ancient Egyptians to plan their entire civilization around the Nile's rhythm, that's breaking down. Climate models project longer dry periods, more intense flooding, less predictable seasons. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation from reservoirs and irrigation channels. Research suggests that even with a 20% increase in rainfall in parts of the basin, hotter and drier conditions overall could quadruple water scarcity by 2040. Over 110 million people in the basin could face severe water stress within just 2 decades. This is the cruel irony. Climate change makes cooperation more necessary exactly when competition over water is intensifying. If all 11 countries work together, they could develop adaptive strategies, share infrastructure, coordinate reservoir management to smooth out variations in flow. But political disputes rooted in colonial-era treaties make that cooperation nearly impossible. Now, let's bring this down from geopolitics to human beings. Because while diplomats argue in conference rooms, real people are living with the consequences. Meet Fatima, a composite of farmers, I'm imagining, in Egypt's Nile Delta. She's in her 50s. Her family has farmed the same land for as long as anyone can remember. She plants wheat and rice following patterns her grandmother taught her. She doesn't know the details of treaties or international law. She knows whether water flows into her fields. She knows whether her crops grow. She knows whether she can feed her children. When Egyptian officials talk about the GERD threatening Egypt's water security, Fatima is who they're talking about. Not in abstract terms, but in the reality of whether her irrigation channels will have enough water next season, whether her family will have income to survive. Now shift to Ethiopia. Picture Almaz in a rural village in western Ethiopia, not far from where the GERD is being built. She's watched her community live without electricity her entire life. Kerosene lamps, candles, children studying by firelight. But now there's talk of the dam bringing electricity, of transformation, of finally joining the modern world. When Ethiopian officials talk about sovereign rights to develop their own resources, Almaz is who they're talking about. The GERD isn't just a diplomatic issue. It's the promise of light in her home, of clinics having refrigeration for vaccines, of economic opportunity beyond subsistence farming. Both women have legitimate needs. Both women deserve better lives for themselves and their children. But the political systems meant to balance these needs have failed, trapped in disputes over colonial-era treaties and contemporary power politics. So we're left with a question that affects over 400 million people. What happens next? Let me paint 3 scenarios. The worst case? Imagine it's 2026. Another drought year hits the Ethiopian highlands. The GERD's reservoir is lower than Ethiopia wants, so they hold back more water. Egypt, already facing severe water stress, sees flow drop below critical levels. Crops fail across the delta. Bread prices spike in Cairo. Protests erupt. Egyptian leaders, facing domestic unrest and genuine existential crisis, decide that diplomatic options have been exhausted. Military aircraft take off from Egyptian bases, heading south. The consequences would be catastrophic: regional war, infrastructure destroyed, economic collapse, diplomatic relationships poisoned for generations, and the water problems? Not solved, just compounded by conflict. Thankfully, this scenario still seems unlikely. The military challenges are significant. The international community would oppose intervention, and both countries have strong incentives to avoid war. But unlikely isn't the same as impossible. The middle scenario, and honestly the one we're currently living, is continued stalemate. Ethiopia operates the GERD according to its own priorities. Egypt continues objecting, continues seeking international intervention. Sudan tries to navigate between both sides. No binding agreement is reached. No major conflict breaks out. But no cooperation develops either. It's better than war, but it's not good. It means lost opportunities for cooperation, inability to plan jointly for climate change, vulnerability to crises that could have been prevented through coordination. Now, the optimistic scenario: imagine it's 2027. After years of frustration, leaders in Cairo, Addis Ababa, and Khartoum realize that continued confrontation serves nobody's interests. They begin with small steps. Egypt and Ethiopia agree to share real-time hydrological data. Sudan facilitates electricity trade arrangements where Ethiopia sells power to Egypt and Sudan at favorable rates, creating economic interdependence. They establish a joint technical committee that operates the GERD and coordinates with Egypt's Aswan Dam. These small collaborations build trust. They demonstrate that cooperation produces better outcomes than confrontation. Over time, this foundation allows more comprehensive agreements addressing the fundamental disputes. This isn't naive optimism. This incremental approach has worked in other river basins. The Rhine River in Europe, once heavily polluted and contested, is now cooperatively managed by 9 countries. The process took decades, but it worked. The Nile could follow a similar path if leaders are willing to prioritize cooperation over confrontation. For this to happen, Egypt would need to accept that colonial-era treaties can't be the basis for 21st century cooperation, that upstream countries will develop their resources regardless of Egyptian objections, and that Egypt's best chance for water security comes through negotiated agreements. Ethiopia would need to recognize Egypt's genuine vulnerability and commit to operating the GERD in ways that avoid causing significant harm. This means accepting binding commitments about minimum flow levels and transparent operations. And all basin countries would need to embrace the principle that the Nile is a shared resource to be jointly managed, not a prize to be divided with winners and losers. Let's return to where we started. That single drop of water falling in the Ethiopian highlands, beginning its journey through 11 countries to the Mediterranean Sea. That drop connects ancient and modern, upstream and downstream, development and survival. It falls on Ethiopian soil, joins the Blue Nile, contributes to Sudanese agriculture, sustains Egyptian civilization, and empties into a sea that connects Africa to the world. That drop doesn't recognize borders. It doesn't care about treaties or sovereignty. It simply flows, following gravity and geology, part of a cycle that has sustained life in northeastern Africa for millennia. The question facing the Nile Basin today is whether human institutions can match the river's natural integration. Can 11 nations sharing one water system find ways to cooperate that serve everyone's interests? Can they transcend historical grievances and colonial legacies to write new agreements suited to contemporary realities? I think about those ancient Egyptian farmers, studying the Nile's rhythms, developing sophisticated technologies to work with the river rather than against it, building a civilization that lasted 5,000 years by understanding they were part of a larger system they had to respect. And I wonder whether modern nations can reclaim that wisdom, can recognize that they are all part of a shared system where everyone's fate is bound together. The Nile that powers nations can either power cooperation or conflict. It can be the foundation for shared prosperity across 11 countries. Or it can become a source of perpetual tension, a driver of conflict, an example of how historical grievances prevent the cooperation that survival requires. The river itself can't make that choice. The water will keep falling in the Ethiopian highlands. It will keep flowing north. It will keep sustaining millions of lives. The choice belongs to the people and leaders of the 11 nations that share it. 5,000 years ago, the Nile created one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The question for this century is whether it can help create something equally remarkable, a model for cooperation that allows 11 nations to thrive together, sharing resources equitably, adapting to climate change collectively, proving that competition over scarce resources doesn't have to end in conflict. We're living through the moment when the Nile's future is being decided. That future will affect not just the people who live along the river today, but generations yet unborn. It will be written in the decisions made in the next few years, and those decisions will echo through the rest of this century. All in all, the Nile dispute is fundamentally a test of whether nations sharing resources can overcome history to cooperate, a test of whether African countries can write their own futures or remain trapped by colonial pasts, a test of whether humanity can adapt to an era of scarcity by working together, or whether we'll compete ourselves into collective disaster. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think it would take for the Nile Basin countries to reach a comprehensive agreement? What would justice look like in this situation? How should we balance historical rights against current development needs? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely value different perspectives on these incredibly complex issues. If you found this exploration valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. And remember, we're all downstream from someone and upstream from someone else.